Clayton! Clayton! Hamish Hamden here for the Dugs. What are your thoughts on the Dugs' new franchise cup?
There ain't no thing. Do you know Dodgers history?
Why, yes,
Let me tell you about Dodgers history. You think Dodgers, you think people like Sandy Koufax, guys like Matt Kemp, who had one of the best Dodger seasons in our history, but that doesn't even include the older guys. Know many people with their number retired in literally every stadium? Well, there's only one, and his name is Jackie Roosevelt Robinson, and that doesn't even touch on guys like Duke Snider and Ralph Branca, Whit Wyatt, Van Mungo.
Clayton!
What?
They're not on your team, Clayton. You've just named a bunch of Brooklyn Dodgers.
Yeah, Brooklyn Dodgers.
They have their own franchise in this cup.
Well, f*** me running. At least we can get out of their way and hopefully someone else will knock them out.
Actually, they're in your qualifying group.
Well, slap my ass and call me Susan. It doesn't matter. Modern era Dodgers like Mike Piazza.
Think you guys deserve Piazza? He had some nice years with the Mets.
You're giving us Piazza, damn it!
Welcome back to the Duds, where everything we do is an excuse to tell a lot of baseball stories and a lot of jokes. We also simulate tournaments on occasion that we then narrate in a half-drunk version of Sportscenter using old game clips. Today's video ushers in our newest tournament, the Franchise Cup. The all-time version of the 30 current MLB franchises have been constructed and will face off against one another in a tournament format inspired by the World Cup. We didn't stop at 30 teams, however. We'll also be including the 6 longest tenured defunct organizations, bringing the total to 36. Here's how it works. We've sorted the 36 teams by their years in existence and broke them into 4 even tiers. The logic being that the longer you've been around, the more opportunity you had to stumble into some valuable players for your roster. The first stage will be the group qualifiers. We are going to create 9 groups of 4 teams apiece, where each group will be randomly assigned 1 team from each tier in order to keep the competition relatively even. Each team in the group faces off against one another once for a total of 3 games apiece. The top team in each group, in terms of their record with tiebreakers going to run differential, are guaranteed a spot in the opening round of the cup. All the second place teams will also have a chance to earn their spot. The top 5 second place teams will also receive an automatic pass to the next round, just the same as the first place teams. The bottom 4 second place teams will be forced into 1-game playoffs against one another to determine the final 2 teams. With our 36 teams being reduced to 16 in the first qualifying round, the group that you land in is absolutely crucial. Let's find out what those groups are, shall we? We've spoiled a little bit so far, so we'll get those out of the way first. The Los Angeles Dodgers are a Tier 2 team in Group A. They sport an extremely formidable combination of Kershaw, Sandy Koufax, and John Drysdale. The support staff also has some high points like Orel Hershiser and a closer that had one of the best seasons of all time in Eric Gagne. Offensively, we threw Kershaw a bone, one that's not a choking hazard, and allowed Piazza to go to the Dodgers instead of the Mets. But aside from the best version of Matt Kemp, the offense ranks as middle of the road compared to the other teams in the tourney. We also jumped the gun on revealing that the Brooklyn Dodgers will be playing in the same group as the Los Angeles chapter, so let's check them off the list. They come in as a Tier 4 team, and you heard us say at the beginning how we tell a lot of baseball stories, right? Well, since people may be less familiar with the defunct franchises, we're going to tell you a little bit more about those in a little feature we like to call Better Know a Franchise. Take it away, Hamish.
Do you know how the Dodgers got their name? The full name was the Trolley Dodgers. Not being killed by the murderous new invention, whose path was quite clearly marked by an overhanging wire and tracks, was apparently a point of pride back then. You see, no one was used to looking both ways before stepping into the street, because prior to the trolley there were horses, and horses generally got out of your way. 3 years into their existence, trolleys had killed 107 people and injured about 450. Trolley mania was running wild. One journal told the story of R.E. Peary, who thought that trolleys were as dangerous as an Arctic expedition. He fled to the west after a trolley had killed his entire family, although to be fair, he had looked at the trolley in the wrong way. If smartphones were a thing back then, the entire population of Brooklyn would have been floating down the East River. Anyhow, Brooklyn had their ups and downs, including a massive collapse in 1951 where their 13.5-game lead over the New York Giants vanished late in the season, capped off by being on the receiving end of a shot heard round the world. However, 4 years later they did get their revenge and take down their only World Series title, beating the Yankees in 7 games, but it was about this time that both the players and their stadium began to age and fall apart. New owner Tom O'Malley tried to secure a new place in New York, but the best offer he could get was a place in Flushing, and let's face it, who would want to play in Flushing? So, not overreacting to this failure in the slightest, he uprooted the team, moved them clear across the country to Los Angeles, but did keep the Dodgers moniker.
The Brooklyn chapter of the Dodgers makes Group A a tough place to play, as they're the second highest rated Tier 4 team. It's not really due to their pitching, as Whit Wyatt, Van Mungo, and Ralph Branca rank number 31 in three-man rotations, and the pitching depth isn't a ton better. However, they're boosted by their offense as they get to start Hall of Famers Jackie Robinson and Duke Snider. With those prematurely revealed teams out of the way, we're now going to be going group to group, revealing our squad starting with the bottom tier. Group B's Tier 4 team is the Seattle Mariners. They come in ranked at 31 out of 36, so they are most certainly one of the underdogs to pull for if you crave disappointment. In what may be viewed as cardinal sin number 1, I'm sure there'll be many, I deprived the squad of Randy Johnson. He'll be showing up a little later on a different team. Instead, King Felix will be flanked by everyone's favorite fireballer Jamie Moyer and Mike Moore. They're helped a bit by their pitching depth with outstanding support in JJ Putz and Matt Young, but I've got their offense ranked at 31 despite featuring Griffey and Ichiro in the starting outfield. Group C's Tier 4 team actually drops a few pegs down the board from that, as it will feature the least tenured team in the Cup, the Washington Nationals. Once again, anything can happen, especially with Max Scherzer and Steven Strasburg in your three-man, but they better pray Strasburg's arm stays glued on as their pitching depth is worse than the tourney. Similar to the Mariners, I think their outfield can do some damage, as they'll be featuring both Bryce Harper and Juan Soto, but again, the reserves leave everything to be desired. Group D's Tier 4 team is the strongest in the tier in the Blue Jays. Roy Halladay and Pat Henshin form a strong 1-2 punch, while Mark Eichhorn completely broke relief pitching for a while, and will hope to do the same in this tourney. The offense is power to spare, featuring Jose Bautista, Josh Donaldson, and Carlos Delgado, and they've got some excellent depth, headlined by Fred McGriff. Group E features our second defunct franchise, so let's turn it back to Hamish for another installment of Better Know a Franchise as we introduce the Montreal Expos.
I just found out the Expos logo is not just a weird looking M, but also the combination of the letters E and B for Expos Baseball. That is a stretch. We've covered the Expos quite a bit on this channel, so I'll do a speedrun of what we've covered. They failed to crack 500 in their first 10 years of existence, but were able to ride the wave of that super weird split season of 1981 to an NLCS berth, where their hearts were broken in a deciding Game 5 moment that's legendary enough to garner its own name in Blue Monday. This meant there needed to be a new order of Montreal baseball, and they were not great again until they assembled a top-notch squad in 1994. They looked to be favourites in the National League before a strike killed the rest of the season, cancelling the playoffs. They were on shaky ground to begin with, and after the strike justifiably pissed the fans off and drove attendance way down, they had to trade all of their top players away before they could demand the larger contracts they deserved. The team eventually came under the ownership of Major League Baseball itself and was eventually relocated to Washington to form Group C's Nationals. Now, a story we haven't covered is how prior to Major League Baseball taking their ownership over, they were nearly just plain voted off the island. In 2001, Major League Baseball was considering knocking off two of the lowest revenue-generating teams in the Expos and the Twins, claiming their lack of revenue was stopping them from fielding a viable team. The league owners voted largely in favour of this idea with a vote tally of 28-2. Guess who the two dissenters were? Yep, the Expos and the Twins, who voted against their own demise, saying, no, we quite dislike that idea. Long story short, both teams survived, at least until it was clear that the Expos would not be able to move to a new stadium in the Montreal area, eventually resulting in their move to Washington. As for the Twins, some say they're still playing baseball to this day, but the jury's still out on that one.
The Expos come in ranked 32nd in the tourney, and I have half a mind to just cancel the cup midway if they start doing well as an homage to 1994. Their starting three ranks 34th and is anchored by Steve Rogers, who was on the receiving end of that Blue Monday home run. On the other hand, their pitching depth is actually quite solid with several impressive relievers, including Ugi Urbina, who, even if he doesn't manage to get you out, still might attempt to hack you to death with a machete and light you on fire. Some guys have nice curves, while others Yeah, their offense isn't a ton better, but features standouts like Vlad Guerrero the Sr. and one of the best catchers in the tourney in Gary Carter. Not much depth on the bench, but I'm sure it'll be fine. I'm sure nothing unfortunate will befall the Expos. Group F brings in the Arizona Diamondbacks, whom I did a massive favor for by handing them Randy Johnson. Sorry, Mariners, but you can't really argue with it. For one, I can't hear you, and for two, upon arriving at the D-backs, Johnson racked up 4 straight Cy Youngs and was runner-up in another year. As you get into the relievers, the highlights get fewer and further between and disappear completely once you flip over to the offense. They have the worst ranked offense in the tourney despite having rights to Paul Goldschmidt and Luis Gonzalez. Group G will sport the fish. Their highest ranked pitcher in Sandy Alcantara actually put up his banner season just this past year, and while the 3-man rotation is not necessarily 3 aces, they are quite consistent without any duds. The bullpen will reunite us with Jose Fernandez, but it's a pretty steep drop off a cliff after that. Offensively, there are a couple of standouts as the world goes, oh yeah, Giancarlo Stanton was a Marlin, and Gary Sheffield and Hanley Ramirez might be able to produce in the unlikely event that anyone else gets on base. Group H is blessed with the lowest ranked team in the entire tourney, but I think it's actually misleading. It's the Rockies pitching that drives their ranking so low, but the criteria to get included on one of these all-time teams is that you played a significant amount of time for the team that you're representing. For a pitcher in Colorado, especially in the Mile High era, that's a recipe for lots of runs pie. Ubaldo Jimenez stands out from the rest as a decent option at the number 1 spot. The bullpen has a couple nice options like Kirk Liskanek and Steve Reed, and a lot of other guys thanking their lucky stars that these games are being played at neutral sites. Unsurprisingly, there are quite a few power threats like Todd Helton and Larry Walker, so there's always a chance that a different stadium will help these guys squeak by as an upset into the next round. I certainly like them better than our last Tier 4 team in the Tampa Bay Rays. Blake Snell, David Price, and Big Game James are going to have to step up as there's little room for error with very little bullpen depth and an offense whose highlight is Carlos Pena. Okay, let's start envisioning some matchups here as we're going to drop everyone's Tier 3 team in. Group A already has 2 teams showing, so let's skip them this round and take a look at the 3rd tier for Group B, which is once again going to send us back to Hamish Amden and his look at the St. Louis Browns.
The Browns started as the first iteration of the Milwaukee Brewers, but back in that era, St. Louis was starting to look pretty good. Yes, believe it or not, the early 20th century was a time when Missouri was actually an attractive destination. St. Louis was the 4th largest city at the time to Milwaukee's ranking of 15, and ownership was begging the commissioner not to move them. They heroically forced the man's hand to allow them one more chance in Milwaukee to prove they were a viable major league squad right where they were. They finished 35.5 games out of first place, and the owner who had so valiantly fought for the team ended up battling tuberculosis all year. As I said, it was the early 20th century. So we were off to St. Louis, and the Browns actually coexisted with the Cardinals for a pretty healthy stretch of time. Across the town, the Cardinals Stadium, which was one of the last ones constructed from wood, started to fall apart, and the Browns owner, out of the kindness of his heart, decided to let the Cardinals share their park in a leasing-style relationship. Meanwhile, the Cards were able to take the proceeds from selling their pile of loosely nailed-together boards that they called their old stadium, and invest in baseball's first proper farm system. This quickly started to produce stars, which shifted the hearts and minds of St. Louis residents over to the Cardinals side, and they started to outdraw their landlords. The Browns started to fall apart, but ownership assured the fans there would be a World Series played at their stadium in the next 5 years. And boy, he was right, when the Cardinals beat the Yankees. That was about the last straw for the Browns, but there was one last piece of interesting drama. The 1944 series featured the Browns facing off against the Cardinals. Both teams still playing at the same stadium meant that the World Series was conducted at the same stadium for every single game, something that wouldn't happen again until 2020, when Arlington, Texas hosted World Series for COVID years. Anyway, the Browns eventually lost in 6 games, and they'd eventually move to Baltimore and become the Orioles, where of course everything went swimmingly.
The Browns ranked 27th in this tourney, so the Mariners could have done much worse in their group mates. The pitching staff is highlighted by excellently named Urban Shocker, and you can find Satchel Paige in their bullpen, who is still good enough in his mid-40s to warrant his inclusion on the team. The highlight on the offensive end is George Sisler, who cracked a .400 batting average twice in his career. And so, from the original Brewers to the Browns to the Orioles, and now back to the current-day Brewers as they'll join the Nationals in Group C. The 3-man rotation is headlined by Teddy Higuera, runner-up in the 1986 Cy Young race. The supporting cast drops off pretty quickly after that as they come in ranked 28th. Offensively, they've got one of the best to ever do it in Robin Yount at short and current Brewer Christian Yelich in the outfield. Group D's Tier 3 team is the Padres, and 3-man rotation is worthy of the tier below them, actually. but if they need it, and it does appear that, in fact, they will need it, they've got some strong arms coming out of the pen in Trevor Hoffman and Mark Davis, a reliever that managed a Cy Young in 1989. The offense is bummed that they can't just produce 13 Tony Gwynns, but will have to make do with the likes of Dave Winfield and Phil Nevin. On to Group E. Despite being the third tier, the Texas Rangers come in ranked third worst in the tourney. Part of the reason was that we couldn't justify giving them Nolan Ryan. Stay tuned for that later. But even if we did, it still wouldn't likely save these guys. The rotation is ranked at number 35, but you could once again potentially blame the park factors, as a couple of their stadiums played smaller than crosstown rival Jose Altuve. Yu Darvish cracked the three-man, as did Charlie Huff and Kenny Rogers. The pitching depth is equally as weak, so let's push on through to the offense. Fresh off his stellar performance in our second season of the experimental baseball tournaments, Josh Hamilton is one of the highlights of the bats, and Pudge Rodriguez will supply some decent support behind the plate. The Oakland Athletics will be joining the Diamondbacks in Group F, ranked 19th overall. It's not necessarily because of their pitching, however, as there's a considerable drop-off in quality after the recently deceased Vita Blue. They sport some big names in the pen in Raleigh Fingers and Dennis Eckersley, so maybe they'll get some help there. The offense is where it's at, as both Bash brothers found their way onto the team, but surprisingly, I currently have Mark McGwire taking a backseat to Jason Giambi at first. When those guys aren't hitting dongs, Ricky Henderson should be stealing all of the bases. We'll need to bring Hamish back in to talk about the 20th ranked team, as Group G's Tier 3 team is the Washington Senators.
So, the problem with the Senators is that you could be referencing the 1891 to 1899 club that were kicked out by the National League when it decided to downsize, or you could be referring to the 1912 squad who played for the United States Baseball League that folded after a year. You could also be referring to the 1961 to 1970 squad that eventually became the Texas Rangers, who fizzled due to just being awful, averaging 90 losses a year and sporting the motto "first in war, first in peace, and still last in the National League." But unsurprisingly, we're not referring to any of those. Our Senators were the guys playing in Washington from 1901 through 1960. These Senators had a fairly rough run, managing 6 last-place finishes in the 40s and 50s. In 1904, they lost 114 games, and 7 years later, their stadium burnt down. But it wasn't all bad. They had one of the best pitchers, if not the best pitcher of all time, in Walter Johnson, who took down 5 ERA titles and is second in all-time career WAR, behind only Babe Ruth. So they were able to ride that blip of skill in their history to a single world title, but swiftly fell back into mediocrity when he retired. Additionally, the popularity and success of the nearby Baltimore Orioles, breathe that in Baltimore fans, you won't hear that much, didn't help stabilise their new fanbase. Clark Griffith, the Senators' owner, died in 1955, and he passed his legacy on to his nephew and adopted son. They said thank you very much, counted to 5 after the man had taken his last breath, and quickly tried to sell the team. This resulted in the squad's move to Minnesota, where they became the Twins. DC was pretty terrible at reading a room, as they launched another version of the Senators in Washington immediately after the relocation, but we already told you how that one turned out. Dead by 1970.
Okay, let's see who we've got. Walter Johnson isn't getting much help in the rotation, but with only 3 games to play in qualifying, a single dominant start could mean a lot. The offensive side of the ball has some notables in Buddy Meyer, Cecil Travis, and Eddie Yost, but all in all, the years of the franchise's failure shines through to land this squad in the 20th slot in the rankings. The second best Tier 3 squad is the Atlanta Braves, who joined the Rockies in Group H. That is a fearsome 3-man rotation in Necro, Maddox, and Glavine, and the depth isn't too shabby either, headed up by John Smoltz. Your offense is going to be in pretty good shape when you have Hank Aaron out there, and Freddie Freeman gets to return home as well, though he'll be taking a backseat to Darrell Evans at first base. Let's go back to Hamish again to hear about our final Tier 3 team, the Philadelphia chapter of the Athletics.
Meet Connie Mack. I'm not certain if he always had a screw loose, but by the end it's pretty apparent there was just a sign saying "screws needed." It seemed that he held just about every front office position for the A's, and also served as their manager. This was how he dressed, and he dressed like this all the time. Now, I'm not one to make fun of one's fashion choices, but I will comment when that fashion choice gets in the way of doing your job, and even back then managers were expected to wear the jerseys of the club that they claimed to be managing. But despite the look being decades past its prime, Connie Mack insisted on his traditional day-to-day attire, which meant that he was barred from entering the field. Think of him as the anti-Lou Piniella. Instead of getting in the umps' faces, he wouldn't even get in the same stadium as the umps. It was an expensive look, and it's possible that that is the reason why he was such a penny pincher when it came to the talent he put on the field. He had 2 dominant stretches with the club which yielded absolutely legendary names, hence the team's high ranking, but once those legendary players would have earned much larger contracts, he'd ship them off and replace them with newer, less expensive players, which led to some significant valleys in between the club's peaks. He was able to ride out the peaks well into his 80s, though he wasn't quite the same man. Reports have him falling asleep in the middle of games, and should anyone attempt to wake him up, well, they might not have a job by the end of the inning. He was actually likely better asleep, as he'd frequently make idiotic strategic decisions, like attempting to put players that had not played on the club for a couple of decades into pinch-hitting situations. His assistant coaches mostly ignored him by this point. Mac's sons eased their father out of the business by the early 50s, but they could never really get on the same page with how things should be run, and eventually the team would relocate to Oakland and become the A's we all know and tolerate today.
Those good stretches yielded a pretty impressive squad. 2 out of the 3 starting pitchers are in the Hall of Fame, and the supporting cast is good enough to land in the top half. There are some legends on the offensive side of the ball as well. Their first baseman hit over 30 home runs in 12 straight seasons, topping out at 58 in 1932, and he's not even the guy with the first name of home run. Okay, Baker played in a much more dead era, but his 9, 10, 11, and 12 home run marks all led the league at one time or another. And Eddie Collins is considered by some to be the best second baseman of all time, so this is a dangerous Tier 3 squad. On to Tier 2. Well, in a second. Let's circle back to Group A, where we already know who Tier 2 is, but we have not yet learned who their 3rd tier team is. Joining the Dodgers is a strong competitor in the Kansas City Royals. They feature a fearsome 3-man rotation in Zach Greinke, Brett Saberhagen, and Kevin Napier, and also have a bunch of strong arms coming out of the pen like Dan Quisenberry, Jeff Montgomery, and Wade Davis. The offense is less impressive as George Brett seems to tower above the rest of his support squad, but with a good rotation, anything is possible in 3 games. Group B is shaping out to be the place to play as the Mariners and St. Louis Browns are 2 of the lower ranked teams in the tourney. Joining them are the Angels. It was a tough decision where to land in between here and the Astros, but many of Nolan Ryan's best seasons occurred in California. That said, he didn't even crack the 3-man rotation, as that honor goes to Frank Chance, Mark Langston, and Frank Tanana. The offense sports current-day legends like Mike Trout and Shohei Ohtani, but the supporting cast makes this one of the least feared offenses in the tourney. Joining the Brewers and Nationals in Group C, it's our first glimpse into the top 10 in the San Francisco Giants. They have a fantastic 1-2 punch in the rotation with Gaylord Perry and Juan Marichal, and Tim Lincecum is also there. There's a lot of depth in the pen as well, so it's going to be hard to score on these guys. Offensively, you know you're doing all right when you've got Barry Bonds and Willie Mays in the same outfield, and they didn't even name the Cove after either of those guys, as Willie McCovey steps up at first. Group D lucks out by getting handed the weakest of the Tier 2 squads in the Baltimore Orioles. Jim Palmer and Mike Messina are a passable top 2 in the rotation, but it's a pretty steep drop-off after that. No one's been more sturdy than Cal Ripken Jr. in their career, so naturally I expect him to get plunked in the head in his first at-bat and vanish from the tourney. It's going to be a tough road, as I have them ranked behind the Blue Jays, and they're still the Tier 1 team to come. The Rangers and Expos seem to have a pretty soft beginning to Group E, but the continued softness in the Houston Astros give both of those teams a chance. The pitching is beatable, as I'd say the most fearsome thing about it is some of the arms coming out of the pen in Octavio Dotel, Brad Lidge, and Billy Wagner. The offense is the highlight for the team, as current standouts like Carlos Correa and Jose Altuve are able to join the killer bees of the previous generation. The Athletics and Diamondbacks have a much stiffer opponent, as the Minnesota Twins will join them in Group F. Their 3-man rotation is consistently strong with Blyleven, Johan Santana, and Frank Viola, and they also have one of the best to ever do it in Joe Nathan in the pen. Their offense features who I think is the strongest catcher in the tourney in Joe Mauer, and he rounds out one of the most dominant infills as they bring Harmon Killebrew and Rod Carew out of retirement / the cold shawl of death. Group G's Tier 2 team goes even one notch above the Twins, as the Mets will join the Marlins and the Senators. The club would seem to have an excellent shot at advancing, as there are not many better rotations than Tom Seaver, Jacob deGrom, and Dwight Gooden. They're going to have to find a way to scratch out some runs, however, as their offense isn't nearly as shiny despite the strong outfield of Howard Johnson, Carlos Beltran, and Darryl Strawberry. Group H already sports the second best Tier 3 squad in the tourney with the Braves, and now they may have just become the group of death. The top-ranked squad in our tourney actually comes from Tier 2. The Rockies are currently crying in a corner somewhere because we're going to drop the New York Yankees into the group. The Yankees are just ridiculous. There are better pitching squads out there, but they do rank in the top 10, and if you don't score off the rotation, you're likely in some trouble as they've got Mariano in the pen. The Yankees offense is the other reason why you'll need to score off the starters, as there's no better offense in the tourney. Ruth, Gehrig, A-Rod, Jeter, Berra, Mantle, Judge. The starters are so solid it was tough to fit Joe DiMaggio in the starting lineup. With that, it's time to bring Hamish on for his curtain call because the final defunct organization is joining the Philadelphia A's and the Tampa Bay Rays in Group I.
Before there were the San Francisco Giants, there were the New York Giants. Now, yes, I know there are a New York Giants now, but there was a New York Giants then too. But this New York Giants played baseball. It's actually where the New York Giants football team of now got their name, which isn't confusing at all. They've had some big moments like Bobby Thompson's shot hard round the world and Willie Mays' famous catch, and they were also known for some, well, dickish moments, like straight up refusing to play the 1904 World Series as the National League representative. This was because the World Series was a new concept at this point. The American League had just been established as a major league 3 years prior, and Giants manager John McGraw considered the new league something to the level of the minors. The commissioner of baseball essentially said, "That's not cool, you can't do that anymore," so when the Giants made it back to the World Series the next year, Hall of Famer pitcher Christy Mathewson pretty much beat the Philadelphia A's all by himself, pitching 3 shutouts. While there are no reports that John McGraw said, "I told you so," he certainly had a self-satisfied smirk on his face that told you so. The club played at the Polo Grounds until it fell apart, quite literally, and they began looking for other places to play. Word on the rumour mill was that the Brooklyn Dodgers were also looking to move out west, but they were getting some pretty serious pushback. Folks out west might change their mind on the matter, however, if they were to perhaps convince an additional team to move to the state of California. And so the Dodgers and Giants joined hands and skipped out west together. Many say they're still the best of friends, and the two fan bases embrace in hugs prior to their games against one another to this very day.
The New York Giants feature the top 3-man rotation in the tourney, but that might be a stretch. Pitchers of the era started so much more frequently than they do today, and thus it was a lot easier to jack up your WAR, which is what I base these rankings heavily upon. So, Amos Russi, Joe McGinnity, and Mickey Welch are going to have to prove they deserve the ranking. Offensively, the biggest name is Mel Ott, and so this team's ability to advance to the next round is going to be heavily dependent on how the older pitchers fit into today's game. Home stretch. Let's close out the groups with the longest tenured squads in the tourney. 2 Dodgers and a Royal walk into a bar and are joined by the Philadelphia Phillies. Again, you have to take the pitching rankings when ancient players are involved with a grain of salt, but I currently have the rotation at second in the tourney as Steve Carlton and Grover Alexander are both Hall of Famers. The pitching depth is solid, and that's where the more recent players show up. I think their offense can be beaten, however. Mike Schmidt and Dick Allen are standouts at the corner infield positions, but we'll see if the rest of the squad can step up when they're facing the excellent rotations that LA and Kansas City have. Group B's Pirates are not among the top options in the tourney, but the group they landed in isn't particularly tough. It would appear that the Pirates have been having trouble getting and holding starting pitching, as the youngest person in their 3-man rotation is still super duper dead. The highlight for this team is the offense featuring legends like Honest Wagner, Archie Vaughn, Roberto Clemente, Willie Stargell, and Ralph Kiner. The lack of pitching in this group might have us headed for some fireworks. The Cardinals represent a tough Tier 1 squad for Group C, so my heart goes out to the Brewers and the Nationals. Bob Gibson is the team's ace, and their pitching depth isn't too shabby either. This is another squad, however, where the offense is a story, and yes, Yachty didn't make the team, and I'm sure I'm going to be yelled at for that at least once, but I had a hard time putting him ahead of Hall of Famer Ted Simmons, and the bench was pretty stacked when you have guys like Pujols, Rogers Hornsby, and Stan Musial in the starting O. We've already gone over the top-ranked team, and here's number 2 in the Boston Red Sox, who find themselves in a group against 3 teams that fall outside the top 20. It's clear how they've ended up in the 2 slot, as they're incredibly balanced on both sides of the ball. I know it doesn't agree with the rankings, but I believe this to be the best pitching staff, featuring Cy Young, Roger Clemens, and Pedro, while the bullpen is also fearsome, including Jonathan Papelbon. Another cardinal sin I committed was excluding David Ortiz from the squad, but that's how good this offense is. Carl Yastrzemski is at first base, and there are several options you could use at DH. Stars like Ted Williams, Mookie Betts, and Nomar are going to make you run out of bench slots real quick. The Reds rank outside the top 10, but they're also landing in another group where all the teams rank outside the top 20. The Reds are another franchise in desperate need of a recent ace, as their 3-man rotation is comprised of pre-1950 stars. Their depth is a bit more current with pitchers like Cueto and Chapman, so they've definitely got some depth to fall back on. I'm going to bet that the Reds' offense is going to prove to be too much for the other teams in this group. Household names are scattered throughout, including Johnny Bench, Pete Rose, Joe Morgan, and Frank Robinson. The White Sox have us turning the clock way back across the majority of their pitching, but Eddie Seacott, Wilbur Wood, and Red Faber are all established stars, as are several arms in the pen. Once again, though, I think this offense is very beatable, as the Athletics and Twins offense ranks significantly above them. Frank Thomas is going to have a good set of qualifying games. Otherwise, I feel this is one of the most threatened Tier 1 squads. Tier 3 and 4 are going to have a tough time in Group G, as the very solid Cleveland Guardians tops this set off. They have a really solid 3-man rotation in Bob Feller, Stan Kowalski, and George Ulay. I couldn't find pronunciation anywhere on the internet, I'm sorry guys. And they've got very solid depth, but the offense is where the money is. It's a great mix of more recent standouts like Victor Martinez, Jim Thome, and Jose Ramirez, with older legends like Tris Speaker, Shoeless Joe Jackson, and Nap Lajoie. Good luck, Senators and Marlins. Last pass through Group H, we nearly guaranteed that this was the group of death when the Yankees were added, but if there was any doubt to that standing, the addition of the Detroit Tigers, third-ranked team in the tourney, should kill any reservations. Hal Newhouser, Dizzy Trout, and Justin Verlander make up the rotation, and the support runs fairly deep as well. The offense, once again, is chock full of legends like Ty Cobb, Charlie Gehringer, and Al Kaline, and when all is said is done, Miguel Cabrera probably fits in pretty well with that group. The Chicago Cubs round out the tourney, as they'll be joining the history-heavy Group I. The Cubs come into the tourney as one of the more balanced teams, as Fergie Jenkins, Mordecai Brown, and Rick Russell make up a formidable rotation, while Bruce Sutter and Lee Smith provide a pretty good back end. There's not a wink link to be had in the offense either, as I'm loving the outfield of Sammy Sosa, Billy Williams, and Hack Wilson. So, that does it. We are going to dedicate a video to every qualifying group, but unlike tournaments of the past, we're not necessarily going to air all of the tourney videos in succession. Our first video will see what comes of the Dodger on Dodger action, but the next video you see on this channel is going to be more story-based. So, if you're new here, there's never been a more important time to subscribe and stay up to date on when this tourney continues. Along with those subscriptions, like would also help us out, and let's hear your predictions in the comments. Who's going to be the Tier 4 team that surprises everyone? Is there going to be a highly ranked team dropping out before we even get out of qualifying? If you're curious how we cut together the results of this tourney, check out our simulation of how the 1994 season would have ended up if it wasn't killed by a strike. For Hamish, I've been Johnny Paprika, hoping all of your balls are fair and all of your wood is good. Good night, everybody!